And so I think not knowing very much what to expect going in, like that kind of led to the experience of the 2 days I was in Kuwait, and I think just how shocked I was by the whole experience.
Hello and welcome to One-Off Travel Stories. I'm your host, Andrew Tawasterna. Each week I will chat with someone about one of their favorite travel stories. That one story that they've told countless times to friends and family around the dinner table. We'll hear captivating and sometimes unbelievable travel tales and learn about the locations where they happened. I'm really excited to have Don Burns joining us on the podcast today. Don is from Toronto, Canada, and has family roots in Winnipeg. He's lived in a number of countries, including France and England. He's a dad and has had a really cool career working with brands like Unilever and then moving to tech, where he spent a number of years at Google. Don also has a really impressive travel resume, and he actually has a special talent of just making really great friends everywhere he goes, lifelong friends. And kind of along that vein, he's going to tell us about a story of his visit to Kuwait. And he sort of had an open invitation from a friend of his who's Kuwaiti, and that open invitation turned out to be one that he took him up on and had quite the experience. And I'll let him go into that in more detail in our discussion today. Hope you enjoy it. Hey, Don, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Andrew, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, of course. Really appreciate you taking the time. I'm excited to hear your story. Before we jump into that, where are you? Where are you right now? Where are you in the world? I know you were just doing some traveling.
Yep, I'm back home in Toronto. I just got back from London, England yesterday. Was there for 5 days, seeing my brother and his family and some friends. And yeah, I moved back from London about a year ago now, so it was good to be back. And it's probably my favorite city in the world, so always love being there.
Nice. It's an amazing city. Good to hear that you were visiting family. I'm also living away from my brother and his newborn, so I know how special that can be. And yeah, like London's awesome. All right, so we got you a little jet lag today. Are you back to Toronto time?
It was good. It was a 5-day trip, and I find like 5 days is perfect because like I don't know, you don't really get adjusted. So I kind of maybe an hour or two off. I was up at like 5 this morning, but it's only about an hour earlier than I usually wake up. So I feel good.
That's good. Yeah, on those 5 days, it always tends to be so busy that all hours of the day just kind of blend, and then you're back home.
Yeah, it was like a very, very hectic, busy trip with like personal stuff, work stuff. So like I was going to bed at like a reasonable hour every night and then like passed out on the flight home. And yeah, I think it's sort of how busy it was just allowed me to adjust pretty easily on both ends.
Nice. Well, again, appreciate you coming on. As you know, this podcast is about travel stories, the ones that sort of made an impact on people's lives, just memories, ones they share with friends over drinks, that kind of stuff. So yeah. Excited to hear your story. Just to get us started, could you give a little background and context? What year are you going to take us to? What's happening in Don Burns' life? Why are you traveling? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, yes, definitely. I think travel for me is something that's had a huge impact on my life. I think traveling has been a really important part of my life and a very important part of sort of the person I've become and the way I see the world. And I love traveling. So I think one thing I've always really enjoyed, I mean, I love going to the Londons and Parises and, Indias of the world, and these places that lots of people go are very popular travel destinations, and they're popular for a reason. But I've always really also enjoyed going to sort of more obscure or off the beaten path places, places where maybe you don't know what to expect, like places like Pakistan, Vietnam, Lebanon, places where maybe, you don't have as many friends who have been to those countries or haven't seen a million Instagram photos, and you're actually a little more surprised. So the location I wanted to talk about, the trip in particular I wanted to talk about, was my trip to Kuwait and Oman, which happened in January, so almost exactly 5 years ago, January 2018. I was going. So this was about 4 years after we graduated from business school. Andrew and I went to business school together at a very international school, and that brought about a lot of, opportunities to meet people from around the world, and in many cases travel to their home countries. So this particular trip was for a wedding of a friend from that school. The wedding was in Dubai. I've, had the opportunity to go to Dubai many times, or not many times, but quite a few number of times. So figured if I was going to the region, I might as well go and see somewhere new. And we had a friend from that same class that was from Kuwait, and a really nice guy, very hospitable. Always had said, if you're ever in the area, come by Kuwait. It's one of those things that I think, a lot of people probably say, yeah, sure. But I figured, hey, I'm going to be next door. I might as well go to this country that I would never otherwise go to. I really didn't know much about Kuwait. Obviously Westerners and people that travel, they've been to Dubai or Abu Dhabi or, maybe even Qatar. But Kuwait, of, sort of the five wealthy Gulf countries, Kuwait's probably the most obscure, the least traveled to. And I figured, hey, why not go check it out and see what Kuwait has to offer, and see a very different culture, and see somewhere that's very much off the beaten path. So yeah, that was really sort of the context of it. Flew via Frankfurt on Lufthansa and arrived in Kuwait on January 17th, 2018.
Okay, so where were you living at the time? Where were you flying from?
I was living in Toronto at the time.
Okay.
So yeah, very long trip from Toronto to Dubai. And just, given that I didn't really feel the need to be in Dubai for any longer than the wedding, I figured might as well make a week-long trip of it and go see somewhere new.
Nice. So it's middle of winter in Canada too. So that's kind of
exactly.
nice. And
exactly.
So somewhat brief drop off in Dubai for a wedding. And then before you arrived in Kuwait, did you kind of, had he said, this is sort of the plan? How did you sort of prepare for the trip?
Yeah, that's actually a funny question, because really he had shared very little with me. I really had no idea what to expect. And he said he'd pick me up at the airport and told me he'd sent me a hotel that I should stay at that I booked. And beyond that, gave me very little information. So I think not knowing very much what to expect going in, like that kind of led to the experience of the 2 days I was in Kuwait, and I think just how shocked I was by the whole experience.
Nice. Yeah, those situations always tend to play out with the most interesting results, whether good or bad. So you were at a wedding. Were you going down to Kuwait solo from the wedding?
No, I traveled there with one friend, a mutual friend of ours named Mark.
Okay.
And we flew from Toronto. He also lives in Toronto. So, and I convinced, this was very much my brainchild. And I convinced him that, what, we're getting older. Mark and I both have kids now. At the time we didn't. So I was like, hey, we're not going to be in the Middle East in January together that often. We might as well make a trip out of it and go visit our friend in Kuwait and just, have a bit of an adventure.
Awesome. I love that. Okay. So you rope someone in post-wedding, long flight to Dubai. Obviously, probably had a lot of fun at the wedding. And then you're off to Kuwait with not a whole lot on the agenda. You're just excited to check out, one of the smaller Gulf nations that people don't generally go visit, basically. I mean, as you put it is a pretty small country. It's not exactly one of the ones that you'd expect.
Yeah, no, that's right. The only clarification is the wedding was actually at the end. So we started this whole trip. This trip started in via Frankfurt, landing in Kuwait City. Then from there we went to Oman, and very quick. We were in Kuwait for 2 days, in Oman really for just one full day, and then from there we actually drove from Oman to to Dubai, which that in itself was a very interesting experience. Probably not one I would have done again. I probably would have just flown. But yeah, the chronology of it was Kuwait, then Oman, then Dubai.
Wicked trip. Okay, so take us to Kuwait.
Cool. Yeah. So we landed. We landed very late. We landed, I think, at about 9 p.m. at night, and after 20 hours of traveling, and the airport extremely modern, very like state of the art airport, which I sort of expected, but very, very not what you'd expect from like the Dubai airport. It was not very like Western. There wasn't a lot of like English. There weren't a lot of Westerners there. It was very clear immediately upon landing that this was not somewhere that quote unquote Western tourists would usually travel to, or an airport that was catering to Western tourists or tourists really of any sort. I think the airport experience was very smooth. Our friend was waiting for us, and yeah, he picked us up and drove us immediately straight to a friend of his house. And yeah, I mean, that was sort of like the start of our Kuwaiti experience. That first night, I mean, it was probably already 10 o'clock at night at this point. But already he had, essentially we'd come to learn that he'd organized this like whole social calendar of all of his network in Kuwait that were, I think, quite like interested and excited to have these two Canadians coming to their country. It was not something they'd experienced very much. And despite the like lack of clarity on the itinerary prior to landing, we pretty quickly came to learn that our friend had gone through like a great deal of trouble of organizing all these things for us, which was a very welcome surprise. And I think the beginning of the experience of just like this incredible sense of hospitality. And that first night, we were at this backyard of his friends, beautiful backyard. They having shisha, barbecue, and it was just like this wonderful experience. And chatting with these Kuwaitis who were all like very intelligent, educated people, spoke great English, and was just like a lovely welcome to the country. And yeah, like learned a lot about a country that I knew very little about in that first night. And the majority of the people there, all of the people there, were a couple years older than me, so they would have all been born in sort of the early to mid 80s. So all would have been alive for like the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which was in 1990, and talked a lot about their memories of that and their parents' experience with that war. And it was just really fascinating. And then also just talking about sort of like day-to-day life in Kuwait was interesting, because like on the surface, Kuwait's obviously a very, very socially conservative country. Alcohol is if very illegal. You can't find it anywhere. Their overall lifestyle is extremely conservative. But if you had dropped someone into that backyard and into that setting, you could have been in California or Texas or something. It was just a beautiful, mild, like beautiful night, and just like very normal, friendly conversation. And it was just a super interesting first night.
I'm curious, since you had that kind of chance to chat with everyone at that party. Did they share much about the change? Like the change must have been drastic from, we're talking when that invasion occurred to today, and how successful Kuwait's been.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was sort of like one undercurrent of the whole trip that I found very interesting. Was obviously, I mean, Kuwait's now one of the like 3 or 4, depending on what metric you want to use, one of the 3 or 4 wealthiest countries in the world. And obviously, just given who our friend was, the people we were with were probably skewing towards like the upper end of this already very wealthy country. And so, I think it was very clear reading between the lines of things people said that these were obviously all very well-off, international, educated people. And despite that, like they were all very, very modest and despite I think this stereotype people sometimes have of the Gulf countries and the flash and the bling. These people like weren't like that at all, and I just thought that was really interesting. And yeah, they definitely alluded to. I think it really more than anything alluded to the physical development of the country, the infrastructure, the like restaurants. So really more so that than like the actual physical visible change that the country's gone through, more so than anything more superficial than that. It was very just sort of focusing on the practical changes that the country had gone through, and the I think the way that they've gravitated more towards this alliance with the other big wealthy Gulf countries, with more with Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, and sort of away from Iraq, which obviously became an adversary after the war. And yeah, just really interesting. I mean, talking to people that live in just what I think is a very unique and different country, and hearing about their experience and this life, this very luxurious or comfortable life that they all live, but yet they do so in from what I can observe, a relatively modest and humble way.
Got it. And so you've landed, and it turns out you have a full itinerary ahead. I've heard lots of things about the hospitality of the region, so I guess that's not a huge surprise. You're at your first night, which is a barbecue, and it sounds like, apart from being in Kuwait, as you said, it felt pretty much like home. Maybe a
Yeah,
summertime barbecue with friends. So anyway,
yeah.
continue on.
No, exactly. I think that what was so eye opening about it is that, like, despite the fact that this country was so vastly different than the Western countries that I spend the majority of my life in, it felt in many ways to be very normal and relatable. And yeah, it wasn't an overly long night because it was quite late by the time we got there, but returned back to the hotel, which I mean, and the hotel was very, very opulent. Just beyond the sort of thing you would ever see in the West. Just like very over the top, gold chandeliers, very like very exotic and opulent decor, and lots of gold and big shiny things everywhere. So it's a beautiful hotel. Went to bed at like a relatively reasonable hour, and then the next day was sort of our first full day in Kuwait, that was really the day I think that I retell to people the most. So I can get into that a little bit.
Yeah, jump in.
Cool. Well, yeah, during the day, our friend picked us up like relatively early, took us on a bit of a driving tour of the city. We went to see sort of like the old markets, which were really interesting. And like, unlike some of the sort of souks or markets that you see in Dubai, or even that we would see later on in Oman, or in Turkey for sure, like the Grand Bazaar. It was not touristy at all. I don't think saw maybe a handful of other sort of Western tourists, but it was very much felt like a local attraction, and lots of people. It was just really interesting experience walking around, and really feeling like you're getting this authentic sort of unexplored snapshot into maybe more traditional Arabian culture, that really wasn't being performative or played up to tourists at all. And then drove around the sort of the downtown area, saw the famous tower, the Kuwait Towers, went sort of the central business district, had this very elaborate Japanese lunch, which was like absolutely delicious. And just throughout the day, just learn more about the country. And one thing our hosts told us is that Kuwait really prides itself on its food. I think you have this extremely wealthy nation where they're not able, at least publicly, to partake in things like drinking or clubbing or partying, and things that in a lot of other wealthy nations, that's something that people do, or some people spend a lot of money on. So what they spent a lot of their disposable income on is just the best food. And Kuwait spends an obscene amount of money flying in the best food, the best ingredients, the best chefs, and you can just get the most incredible food there. So we went to, I think it was a French restaurant for lunch. We went to Japanese for dinner, French restaurant for lunch, and it was just spectacular food. As good as any food I had in France, and just a really great experience. Then in the afternoon, we sort of did a little more touring, went to a mall, drove around some more, went back to the hotel, sort of freshened up. So a pretty uneventful day, but just a really interesting day, like traveling around, learning a little bit more about the country. I was very interested, as I am with all those countries, very interested in the royal family and the leadership structure. So I asked a lot of questions about that, and that's just something I found very interesting. And it seemed to be Kuwaitis all live a really good life, and they seem to all have a lot of sincere reverence for the royal family, and just a very different system of governance, obviously, than the one we're used to. But it's just I find fascinating, and I think there's obviously sometimes a stigma in the West of autocratic governments, or a totally non-democratic system of government. But it, not just in Kuwait, but anywhere I've been in that region, it always sort of paints a much different picture. And people in those countries, I'm sure it has its flaws, but they seem genuinely appreciative and grateful and reverent for the leaders in place. So I always find that to be a very interesting part of exploring that part of the world.
And just for clarity, what is their government? What is the government structure in Kuwait?
They have a king. I mean, I can't remember I can find it.
So it's it's a monarchy.
Yeah, it's a monarchy.
Okay.
I believe he actually passed away. It's an emir. So yeah, similar, right, I guess, to the Emirates. It's technically an emirate. I'm not exactly sure the distinction, to be honest, but yeah, he is an emir of Kuwait. I believe he actually passed away about 3 weeks ago. So very topical. And there was a great deal of respect shown to him, I think, not just in Kuwait, but in the region. So yeah, and we never actually saw the royal palace, but I gathered there were 2 or 3 large royal palaces. I'm sure they're somewhat hidden from public view, but from what I gather, they're extremely opulent. And I think our host had been to the palace on 1 or 2 occasions for whatever reason, and just really, really crazy hearing stories about that.
Curious to just backtrack a little bit here, but about the food, that's actually really interesting and a cool way to put it, as in they really spend, if they're going to spend on something, it's going to be great food. You had what did you say, Japanese and French. Curious about, is there obviously a Kuwaiti style dish, something more specific to the country and when they served you the night before, did they focus more on that food or?
Yeah, so I think the night before we had a barbecue, and I think it was more traditional. I don't know if it's necessarily unique to Kuwait. It's probably more unique to that part of the Arabian Peninsula. I don't know how distinct it would be from Emirati food or Saudi food, but definitely very lamb, I know, is a big part of it, and barbecue is certainly a big part of it. So I think we had barbecue lamb shisha, or shish kebab, and it's very good, very heavily seasoned, but certainly nothing. I don't think Kuwaiti cuisine is it's not renowned for its diversity. I don't think. I think it's pretty straightforward. They have a few dishes. And I don't think other than that I think everything other than that first meal, which was very casual, we had was international food.
Interesting. Okay, so you've done the tour, day 1, seen some markets, and it sounds like I've been eating very well up to this point. Almost you might as well be in London, going around to restaurants of different international cuisine. So okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. So then the night, I think it was a Saturday night, but whatever, or it wouldn't have been a Saturday night. Maybe it was. It was a Saturday night. That would have been our second night there, and we had a full day there, and we were able to start early, and it was That was such an amazing night. That night was the night I'll never forget. I think we started by going to our host. We went to his house, just like a beautiful, beautiful house. And, we had like this amazing wine. And again, like this is a country where I think you're not allowed to drink. People don't drink in public. You can't find alcohol anywhere at restaurants. But I think it's sort of like understood that within private homes, especially probably of, sort of the upper class, your people can do what they want. So yeah, we had like this amazing wine and just really enjoyed like sort of an early or late afternoon, early evening start to the day, or to the evening. And then we drove to this Japanese restaurant that my friend had rented out. So we rented out this entire restaurant. It was in a skyscraper. So I can't remember the specifics, but we went to this underground parking lot, went up to like the sixth floor of some office tower, and it was like an entire floor he had rented out, and there were like 80 or 90 people there. There was like a ton of people there that he had invited. I think this is just sort of the thing he does, but he really had specifically invited all these people here for my friend Mark and I. And yeah, I mean, it was basically like a full-on party with like the best Japanese food, or up there with the best Japanese food I've ever had. And it was amazing. I mean, I talked to like dozens of people. Everyone was super friendly. It was all just a really, really amazing experience.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing. So you were basically celebrities
Yeah,
for a
yeah. I
night.
mean, I think they really aren't used to having that many sort of. I think there's probably a decent amount of Westerners that come for business. Like, obviously being such an oil rich state, I'm sure there's lots of German or British or American business people that come that work in the oil industry, whatever. But I think in terms of just for pure tourism, purely out of interest, the amount of Westerners or North Americans is very, very low. So I was obviously very interested in learning more about Kuwait, and they were very interested in learning more about like our lives. And most of these people were well traveled, so it's not like they'd never been to the West, but they were still just very interested in hearing more about day to day life in Canada, and just had a number of hours full of just really interesting conversation.
And were you given a heads up, or did you just kind of show up to this restaurant and you were like, "Hey, this is our dinner reservation," and you like go up to what floor were you on?
It
Yeah,
was
tell
like
me more about the restaurant.
yeah, it was like the seventh or eighth floor, like very modern, like very like beautifully decorated, amazing decor, and like a staff of 20. But our host had kind of alluded in a very nonchalant way, like, yeah, some of my friends are coming, but definitely didn't really like give us a full picture of that was going to be like basically a full on party. So yeah, it was like quite a surprise, and I felt like very honored. I mean, it was a very unique experience. Like I don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like it, and it was just like the continuation of really what I discovered when that first night at the barbecue, that this country was just like really way more welcoming and warm and friendly than I ever could have imagined. And literally every conversation I had, everyone was incredibly friendly and interesting and very happy to talk. And just when you think about sometimes the misguided perceptions that some Westerners might have of the Middle East or of Arabic culture, it's so funny because that really could not be further from the truth, at least in the vast majority of instances I've experienced.
I've got a couple of questions, but just on that one, do you think if you were just showing up as a tourist with no guide, if you will, can you imagine if someone wants to travel there, doesn't have any friends there, how do you think it would be?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine very different. I think our friend in particular is extremely is a very, very hospitable, like friendly, generous guy. He goes out of his way. Even with my experiences with him before going to his country, he'd always been very generous, and really wanted to make sure everyone was having a good time. And so I think that was definitely a big part of it. But the fact that all of his friends were also It's just so nice and welcoming to us. Was, I think, was just an amazing surprise.
And I was curious too. It just came to mind, but what was everyone wearing? What were you wearing?
Yeah, I was dressed a little more like formally than I would otherwise on like a night out. I was wearing like a jacket and dress shirt. I think in general people were dressed like business casual almost.
Okay.
So certainly not, they weren't wearing like hoodies and stuff, but they were dressed in very Western attire overall. No one was wearing like the traditional dish dash or anything like that. They were out and about during the day. But at that event, everyone was wearing, yeah, very Western attire and just maybe a little bit more on the formal side.
Okay. And yeah, like did it turn into a party as we think of one in the Western style of things?
Yeah, no, it very much did. I mean, there was like, so I think obviously the restaurant knew, but the restaurant I think wasn't able to serve us anything. So they had essentially brought in their own alcohol, and I think there's various ways you can get alcohol in these countries, but through embassies is the main one. And obviously, someone at this party had gone to great lengths to stock it up, and there was just like, yeah, but the excellent wine, beer, really anything you could think of. And I think all of us that were there, at least myself and Mark and our host, definitely indulged in quite a lot. So yeah, I mean, it's not the first time I've been in that situation. I think Pakistan comes to mind as well, where I was sort of getting inebriated in a country where you weren't even allowed to drink, and it's always a bit of a surreal experience. And I think I asked like numerous people, like, are we going to get in trouble? Like, how do we know the police aren't going to come in? And they just all sort of laughed at that. So I think it was clear that behind closed doors, this sort of behavior is pretty common, and everyone sort of turns a blind eye. And a few of them did actually have stories about either them or people they knew getting in trouble with the police. But it never sounded like it ever became that big of a problem.
And what was the music of choice?
It was very just Western pop music, from what I can remember. Nothing, nothing local really. It's just sort of the same music you'd hear at a party in Toronto, I think.
Okay. Well, I mean, you pretty much only hear Drake, but
True. Um,
I that's amazing. I mean, an experience like that, just having like a party in your honor,
yeah,
whether
it
anywhere
was
really would
crazy.
be kind of fun. But
Yeah, and then we ended up driving. So we ended up driving to another classmate of ours' house, and he had this beautiful mansion with this huge pool, and he had also thrown a party. It seemed like there was actually some confusion between the two. I'm not sure. I never really understood if he threw his party for us, but he also had a party at his house that same night, and we ended up spending another 2 or 3 hours there. And I think we were out till like 4 or 5 in the morning that night. And again, like that party was similar. That party was, I think it was happening regardless, but still at that party, we met a lot of amazing people. People were super friendly. And yeah, I mean, it was just like two different parties that you could have been, aside from maybe like the makeup of the attendees, because it was certainly mostly local Arabic Kuwaitis. Aside from that, in terms of the atmosphere of the parties, you could have been in any city in the West, and they were both a lot of fun and had an amazing night. Honestly, it was like one of the most fun nights of my life. So for that to happen in a country where theoretically you're not even allowed to drink or do any of these things was pretty remarkable.
yeah, and not to mention it was basically National Dawn and Mark Day in Kuwait. That's
Yeah, exactly.
how many parties were being thrown in your honor that night? You'll never know.
I'll never know. There could have been more. We just ran out of time. So then,
That's
yeah, then the night concluded on a funny note. We went. Our host drove us home, and it had been quite a long night at this point, and I think we were all probably a little worse for wear at that point. Like I said, it was probably 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, and he dropped us off at our hotel, and there was one other friend of ours in the car. And the next morning, we learned after he dropped us off at the hotel, his car, he ran out of gas on the freeway, on the highway,
Oops.
and because he hadn't been paying attention, and so he was stranded in a car with no gas on the highway at 5 a.m. And the police
Uh-oh.
eventually came to see what was going on. And yeah, we came to learn he just called up a driver that worked for him and got in the car and left his car there and left the police there, and that was the end of it. So I mean, that to me was just wild. And then the fact that he just left his, I think it was a Maserati, just left it on the highway. It's just, I think speaks to the level of wealth
Right.
that existed in this country. And again, it's a level of wealth that, like I said earlier, people were not overly ostentatious or flashy about, but it's one of those things that there's certainly signs, people's clothing, or just reading between the lines of things they said. It was very obvious, without people having to make it obvious, that this was a country of immense wealth. And I think my friend leaving his Maserati on the highway and not being overly concerned about it was definitely a very more less subtle indication of that.
Yeah, so it sounds like these moments just kind of pop up and you're like,
Yeah, exactly. It's just a really wild place and a wild experience, and very, very, very different than really anywhere I'd ever been before. And so, yeah, it really felt like we were getting this peek into this, just a total other world and another way of living where, in some ways there's things that were very similar to the prosperous Western nations that we're used to, but in other ways, it couldn't be more different. So just an interesting, I think, takeaway that even though sometimes on paper people can live in a country with a very different culture than our own, I think in many ways we're all very similar, and we're all humans, as cliche as that is.
So was that your last night there? Maybe you woke up feeling a little rough the next day if you're out till 4 or 5 in the morning, but
yeah, I think our next day started quite late, and then we had one more day there, which I know I can speak for myself, was pretty hungover. So on the last day, we went to a different friend's house, and this friend lived in again a very opulent house. It was a little different. So the other sort of houses we've been to were very modern, and this house was felt very old school, like sort of like big, beautiful Persian carpets, gold chandeliers, like painting, all this beautiful Arabic art on the walls.
are they multi-storied houses? Are they more like bungalows?
Most of them were like 2-story houses, but then
Okay.
this is the middle of the desert. I don't think, even though it is a small country, land is certainly not at a premium. So they definitely tended to be very large properties, and were built more in terms of footprint versus building up. So yeah, I don't think we saw any that was more than 2 stories, but they all tended to be quite big and have just very big open space. So yeah, then I think there's a somewhat famous photo I posted on Instagram once. Not famous, but a photo that a lot of my friends would have seen, where Mark and I were wearing the local garb, which I believe is called a dish dash. So they went out and bought us this. So I think in the West sometimes people would consider that cultural appropriation or inappropriate, but it was they had really gone out of their way. They wanted us to wear this attire, and so we put it on. I mean, I loved it. It was very comfortable, and I liked the way it looks. So that was funny. We walked around the house. We ordered a big sort of similar local barbecue type food, and had this big meal. I think it was 5 of us, and we were probably seated around this table that could hold 25, this massive table that's likely used for these big family banquets. So that was a pretty funny mental picture, a funny visual of Mark and I in our local Kuwaiti dish dash and headdresses sitting around this massive table eating barbecue, which was funny.
When in Rome, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then, yeah, then later that day we went to a poker game, which again, not something you would expect to find in that part of the world, but sort of this like informal poker game with 6 people, and we both played in it, and people were very friendly about it. And um, one of these, this guy I'd never met before. I didn't have any money, I didn't have any cash, so someone I'd never met before just gave me a bunch of chips. Like I think that were worth a few $100s, and which I then proceeded to lose. And he just sort of said, "Okay, don't worry about it." Like just, which I think just speaks again just how friendly these people are. I mean, I'd never met that guy and will very likely never see him again in my life. And he was like more than happy to give me some money so I could play poker for 45 minutes. And then, yeah, that was a really fun experience. And then ended up going to another party that night. It was a little more, it was a little tamer of a party. I was a friend of a friend's, and there was like more people their parents' age there, but met a bunch of really interesting people. And then, yeah, then that was it. That was the end of, we went back to the hotel, and then I think we had a very early flight the next day to Oman. So that was the end of the Kuwaiti experience, but it was a hell of an experience.
Wow. I just, after all this, it just seems like, again, you might as well have been foreign ambassadors from Canada. Maybe even treated better than they would, because there's no real suspicion on you. So
exactly. I mean, I think it goes to show, and it's something I've like done before and since, like sometimes going off the beaten path, going somewhere where you're not expected. You not only are you don't know what to expect, or you're gonna get to see something and that's gonna surprise you and really like explore sort of the the real origin of travel is about exploration and finding out new things and new cultures. And I think a lot of ways that's not what it's become. It's become going to the same places over and over again. And I think, yeah, that experience in Kuwait just goes to show, like, when you really go somewhere different. And before I went, a lot of people were like, "Why would you go there? That's so random, blah blah blah." But when you go somewhere different and somewhere that is off the beaten path, or at least atypical for a tourist to go, sometimes you have the most amazing experiences. And I think that's something I try to remember, and remember just how pleasantly surprised I was from that experience.
And I'll add in on that, and you can tell me if you agree, but I think anytime you meet someone who invites you to their home culture,
Yeah.
wherever that is, like jump at the opportunity when you get the chance.
100%. Yeah, and that's a good caveat, because I'm sure my experience, and you alluded to it earlier, would have been very different if we didn't have this friend there. But I think this was this very generous, hospitable guy who would often say, "Come to Kuwait," and probably said that to dozens and dozens of people. And I think Mark and I were the first people that didn't at least live in the region. We were the first people to actually take him up on that. And I think there was a mutual appreciation for that. I think we really appreciated that he was so sincere with that invitation and really stepped up to show us an amazing time. And I think he appreciated that we came all the way from Canada and took him up on the invitation. And I think for everyone, it was a really wonderful experience.
Well, I don't know about the other friends you've told the story to, but I'm definitely going to try to stop in Kuwait after hearing this whole story. That's 100%.
Hey, I'd go back. I'd go back with you. It was great. I mean, maybe we're a few years older now. We could maybe experience more of that renowned cuisine and maybe a little less of the drinking. But in any case, it's a really amazing country, and I'm sure, like with any of those countries in that part of the world, they're just developing and changing so quickly. I'm sure there'd be a whole new side of it to explore.
Definitely. Well, again, really appreciate you coming on, telling the story. It was very, very interesting to learn about Kuwait, a country I didn't know a whole lot about. And I'm loving the Mark and Don famous in Kuwait. So
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.
Well, a big thank you to Don for coming on the show and sharing his amazing adventure in Kuwait. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you happen to have a great story, a travel story that you'd like to share, please find me at oneofftravelstories.com.